Your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome in your name? Thank you. Minutes.
Society of Antiquaries of London, ordinary meeting, Thursday, 13th of April, 2023. Professor Martin Millett, President in the chair. The minutes of the ordinary meeting of Thursday, the 6th of April, 2023 were read and signed. The following communication was then laid before the Society: the Cedar DNA Revolution in Archaeology, Current Progress and Future Potential by Anthony Brown, FSA. Thanks were returned for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting would be on Thursday, the 20th of April, 2023, then adjourned the meeting. Reception followed.
Is it your pleasure to sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Thank you. We now come to the main business of today's meeting, which is to hear a paper from our fellow Dr. Rosemary Weinstein. Rosemary was curator at the former London Museum, Kensington Palace, and then its successor, the Museum of London and the Barbican, where the Cheapside Hoard is held. Early work on the hoard in the 1980s was understandably overtaken by what I think is described as a flood of objects coming from mudlarking and other sources. She developed an interest in rare surviving medieval and early modern pewter vessels, tin alloy, which was the subject of her 2011 doctoral thesis. Since retirement, she has had time to return to the hoard, which she's now going to talk to us about in her lecture, Who Hid the Cheapside Hoard? A Goldsmiths Row Mystery Resolved. Welcome, Rosemary.
Well, I'd like to thank members of the Goldsmiths Company for access to their records over a number of years, to librarians and archivists, their past and present, for their assistance, and for use of their database of London goldsmiths in the 16th and 17th century, set up by Dr. David Mitchell with assistance from Mark Merry. I'd also like to thank Sheila O'Connell, the editor of the London Topographical Society, for helping me get my article into print in the 2021 record of that year, and for those who gave helpful comments, especially Dorian Gerhold and John Cherry. Well, the Cheapside Hoard, of course, was found in 1912 by a workman apparently putting his pick through a chalk floor, and it was subsequently acquired by the former London Museum, then opening its doors at Kensington Palace and in need of early collections. And so we find that it was ultimately distributed between the London Museum, the British Museum, the Guildhall Museum, which was the established museum in the City of London, and the Victoria and Albert Museum. And over the past century, it's been much studied and published. A catalogue was published by the London Museum in 1928 with the crucial information that this was found on the site of Wakefield House. No further address was given, so it was presumed that Londoners knew very well where Wakefield House was. but it's easy to track down through the London directories as 30 to 32 Cheapside, which is on the site of one new change, the present day large new shopping complex. And Dame Joan Evans published her work in the 1930s, giving a very tight date range of 1610 to 1620. And subsequently, later writers have broadened that date range. Diana Scarisbrick, the early first half of the 17th century, but with particular emphasis on the first 3 decades. The one thing that hadn't been done was really to pin down whose jewelry it was, who was the man responsible for that. So I set myself 3 challenges. One, to find the name of a jeweler who was important enough to have owned this jewelry. 2, to be able to prove that the premises that he had was on the site of Wakefield House or very close to it. And thirdly, to be able to explain why it might have been that he hid it and in fact didn't come back. Well, Cheapside Hoard that you see here in an earlier display from the Museum of London has a terrific range of gems. And the eye probably goes first to that wonderful translucent hexagonal emerald, a gem indeed of world status. But then quite close, these little chains are very tiny gems enhanced with enameling. Sometimes these are described as mercantile jewelry or gentry status jewelry, obviously very much less expensive, and the sort of thing it's been described as you would have been able to buy perhaps in the jewelry shop in Cheapside. The importance of them being in the hoard is that jewelry of this status doesn't normally survive. So the Cheapside hoard has become probably the main source of study of jewelry of the early 17th century of this type. I think that the bowls here of hard stone, of agate and jasper probably, these are presenting some new information. And I owe this interpretation to the designer goldsmith Peter Page, who interpreted these as mortars for grinding up the glass for enameling. And indeed, there are 2 or more broken knife hafts of jade and agate in the hoard, which could have been used as pestles. So this is very important information that we have tools actually amongst a collection of jewelry. So that would help again to sort out that it was not a household assemblage, it is a jeweler's stock. And of course, there are turquoise cuttings also in the hoard, which support that information. New evidence coming from the 2013 exhibition at the Museum of London, the anniversary exhibition. The goldsmiths assayed all the pieces and found that it was 19.2 carat gold, not the standard 22 carat. So this opens up, I think, a range of questions as to why this might have been the case. Was it that the jeweler had taken it in for remounting? Was it a stranger jeweler more used to working at that standard, the Paris touch? these are questions that remain unanswered. Well, the site of the hoard was, as I say, 3032 Cheapside. This is the city engineer's plan of the site, which was demolished in 1911, and 30, 31 and 32 here. And it's between Fountain Court, as you see, and Friday Street. This, as I mentioned, was the site of one new change today, more or less opposite Wood Street and Gutter Lane. The demolition happened in two phases, 30, 31 and 32, and 33 all came down together, and then 34, 35 and 36 subsequently. All the blue is Goldsmiths freehold, and the company were going to add the site of the church, which is here. This is St. Matthew Friday Street, which had already been demolished in 1880 and was going to be added to the portfolio, as well as the hatched areas here. And the dark red below that was going to be used as widening of Friday Street by the city corporation. We're looking sort of westward here, Fountain Court. This is called St. Matthew's Alley in earlier maps, and shows a little way through to the churchyard and church of St. Matthew Friday Street. Well, going back to the 18th century, we have the first street numberings, which were gradually introduced from the 1760s. This is Richard Hallward's map of 1799. I think you can pick out 32 and 33, and then a jump to 34, because already by this date, 32 has squeezed itself a bit up eastwards. So number 33 has actually disappeared. This is quite important because Wakefield House was larger than the goldsmithing business that was there in the 17th century. So we have to take that into account when we're trying to track down the goldsmiths on this particular site. Here's St. Matthew Friday Street here, and the little alley which runs down here. Well, the 17th century doesn't produce maps like that, unfortunately, but what it does produce are lists of individuals who lived along Cheapside. And particularly useful are the tithes. This one was 1638, this one was 1650, and we also have a hearth tax of 1664. Tithes were assessments made by the local clergy based on your rental value of your property, for money for supporting the local church. And the good thing, or at least from a historian's point of view about tithe, is that everybody had to pay tithe. So they're very comprehensive. And that gives us some confidence that the individuals listed along Friday Street here and Cheapside were mostly all the people who were there at that time. And I'm glad to say I can also double check these names against leases in the Goldsmiths Company. So they're not distant landlords. These are the people who were actually living there. And just to look at the 1638 tithe, really, as you start at the church and we move up Friday Street, Mr. Guy, probably Peter Guy, is the only goldsmith in Friday Street. And he was a plate worker. That is, he made silver vessels or silver gilt vessels. And he was a specialist in making salts. And we know this because one of them was substandard, which he tried to sell to Mr. Gibbon over here in Cheapside. The sorts were substandard because he had piece marked, and later he'd added additions to it, which was against company regulations. We're turning up into Cheapside and then round the corner and down westwards along Cheapside. There's the Wheatsheaf, which was a Goldsmiths Company property, which was probably a tavern or inn at some stage. We find that these places maintained their names, whereas shops changed their names according to the owner's change. The one that really is important for us is down here, Gibbon, who you can see has a rent of 40 shillings, which is much more than all the others in the street, obviously much bigger premises. Gibbon and Taylor and Mr. Pressick. The double line here represents the alley. So we're on the edge or the corner of that alley. This is, as I should say, my working diagram of finding out who was living where. So we think that Gibbon, Taylor and Pressick are on the site of 31 and 32 Cheapside, which we saw earlier. Mr. Gibbon is also noted in Ambrose Heal's London Goldsmiths. And the G's, which you notice up and down, are when I've been able to identify them, that they were plate workers, and the J when they were jewelers. And I've taken my bearings from David Mitchell because he is able to distinguish in his database what the specialisms of these individuals were. And that's important for us in the early 17th century. And of course, trying to pick out which of these men might have been the jeweler. I discovered this tithe back in the 1980s, and I thought, well, it must be one of these men. And indeed, as we see, it was. Well, Ambrose Heal makes a list of goldsmiths in various enterprises throughout London. And he noted the name of Mr. Gibbon as working at the Blackmore's Head in Cheapside. And he'll also list the other goldsmiths who work there. After Mr. Gibbon comes Robert Cuthbert. Then we have a Mr. Beach and a Mr. Wildman. And finally, we have William Smith. And you can see on his trade card that he was working at the Blackmore's Head. The other thing that Heal notes, and it was of critical information for me, was that he annotates the card, this trade card, with the information that William Smith advertises to his clients in 1769, May of that year, that he's going to move to Milk Street. And he says he's going to move from 32 Cheapside. Well, since street numbering had only been introduced in 1760, and here he is in 1769, moving from his address, I think we can assume safely that the Blackmore's Head and 32 Cheapside are one and the same place. That is, all those list of goldsmiths were actually working on the site of Wakefield House, or what became Wakefield House in the 20th century. I think that was my eureka moment at the British Museum. Well, turning then to the Goldsmiths Company leases, this is their survey done in 1692 by John Ward, and it lists what shows us here all the leases that they had in Cheapside. And fortunately, they have a rental which also accompanies this, and it's titled An Index to the Survey of the Goldsmiths Rents. And in that index or list, I recognized one name, and that was Robert Cuthbert, whom Heel had noted was at the Blackmoor's Head. And Robert Cuthbert has 26, 27, and 28, those leases. So this must therefore be part of the Blackmoor's Head and part of the later Wakefield House. So this was, of course, the basis from which one could start to begin to identify the Goldsmiths and whether they were relevant to our inquiry. And here you have it in a bit more detail. Well, if Robert Cuthbert, perhaps I should, yes, Robert Cuthbert was a very interesting man, but he isn't really relevant to our inquiry because he came to the premises only in 1664, which is too late for the Cheapside Hoard. He was what we call a small worker. That is, he made rattles and snuff boxes and buckles for shoes, things of that nature. But he was an extremely important Cheapside goldsmith, and he's listed in Lee's Little London Directory because he had a running cash, which he established in 1677. So he's sort of just the early stages of banking, if you like, but he's not particularly relevant for our inquiry. And this is his predecessor, a man called William Gibbon, who in fact is the son of the man who was listed in our tithe assessment. And neither is he a jeweler, he's a plate worker. But interestingly, at the end of his career, he took up the role of treasurer at Christ's Hospital. And it was quite a done thing for eminent London citizens to assist the city's various charities in this way. And William Gibbon, as you see his portrait here, took up that particular role and had his portrait painted that year, 1662. And it's the tradition at Christ's Hospital that treasurers have their portraits painted and they hang in the courtroom as Gibbons does today. Well, if William Gibbon then is not relevant to the inquiry, what about his father who trained him? Simon Gibbon gave this quite dazzling, spectacular silver, gilt and crystal salt to the company in 1632. Simon also was a plate worker, and it certainly raised eyebrows as to why he should have given this salt that year, just after a major search by the company in Cheapside. Did he have something to hide? We don't know. I think perhaps more relevantly, his son William was up for the livery that year, and subsequently after the donation, William was duly elected to the livery, or maybe it was a sweetener of that sort. But even more interesting for us in our present inquiry is that Simon Gibbon was commissioned by the Prerogative Court of Canterbury to inventory the jewels of George Heriot, the Queen's jeweller who had died the year before in 1623. And he was commissioned along with David Papillon and Jacob Hardret, the lapidary. And you can see their signatures here, Simon Gibbon, David Papillon, and Jacob Hardret. And they made a wonderful job of this inventory, very extensive inventory, as you imagine, dividing it up into sections and then signing off each section, and fascinating details of the types of gems and how they were stored in boxes with the values, or sometimes in a cabinet, or at other times just in a paper. Very, very interesting information. But we cannot really link Simon Gibbon, the plate worker, with any idea that he was a working jeweler. He doesn't sell jewels in his shop that we have any information of, anything of that nature. So sadly, we have to pass him over as well, although he is of very considerable interest. Well, Simon Gibbon had taken on the lease from none other than Sir Hugh Middleton, of course, a household name at that time, the entrepreneur behind the New River. And Hugh Middleton takes up this lease on the Blackmore's Head site in 1607. He's not there very long. He's upper warden of the Goldsmiths Company in 1610, and then he's moved off by 1613 to another of his premises in Wood Street, to which he's laid on the New River, practically, and where his youngest son, Simon, is born. Well, it would have been horrendous to be able to say that actually this jewellery was Hugh Middleton's. And although Hugh Middleton had been a merchant jeweller early in his career, before coming to the Blackmore's Head, it would seem that there was nothing sustaining about that particular work, and that he had fingers in many other pies, whether it was lead mining in Wales or draining harbours. He was not a working jeweller. He leaves a very extensive will and a lot of jewellery in the will to his wife, but he says it's already in her possession. And by then, 1631, the year he died, they were living in Enfield. So there's no particular connection, sadly, between Middleton and the Cheapside Hoard. And the very extensive will would surely have left some indication in it that there was still jewellery back in Cheapside, or he'd made some deal with the incoming jeweller or goldsmith, something of that kind, but that was not the case. Well, there was one other man on this site, and that was the man who had the lease 29, that is number 31. That was a man called Richard Taylor, who'd come to the property in the 1620s and who'd had a rather rocky start as a jeweller and been imprisoned in the Wood Street counter because his jewellery was of such poor quality. Fascinatingly for us, the sort of things that are listed by the Goldsmiths Company that he'd had were very similar to the Cheapside Hoard. But it would seem that after coming to the Cheapside property, taking on the lease, he turned over a new leaf. He married the daughter of Leonard Stanley, who was a leading goldsmith, and subsequently he helped his father-in-law distribute his wares. And Leonard Stanley made Magdalen cups, and we find Richard Taylor actually going around the fairs. He's noted as being in West Chester, which is Chester Fair. And unfortunately for him, Stanley hadn't marked or touched his bowls that he'd given his son-in-law, and so they were confiscated at this fair. And even after Stanley's death, Richard Taylor seemed to maintain this sort of peripatetic lifestyle, because the wardens of the Goldsmiths tried to get him to take on the role of touch warden, and he refused, saying that he spent his summers in the country and in the winter he was troubled with gout. So that's what put the seal on his work for the company. He was not of sufficient importance to have owned jewellery, even if he'd carried on the trade. So I think, again, he was another person that we pass over. So very disappointingly, it seems that none of the individuals on the site of Wakefield House actually were working jewellers. So we must look back at the tithe list to see who, in fact, what the neighbours of the people living on this site could have been specialising in. So we said that Mr. Gibbon, Mr. Taylor, and Mr. Pressick were on the site of Wakefield House. Going back as a neighbour, Mr. Wheeler, William Wheeler was a goldsmith. He was a plate worker. He was not a jeweller. His wife, after his death, which was a year after this tithe was taken, did marry a jeweller, a man called John Bonner, but subsequently they lived in the Poultry. They weren't living here, and Mr. Bonner had a shop in the Royal Exchange. They maintained the property, they sublet it, and they rebuilt it after the fire. But again, there's no particular connection of their daily working life as jewellers with this site. And similarly, Mr. Frith, who had been an apprentice of William Rogers, who had sold jewellery to the Crown, but Frith we know very little about, and he's there only a couple of years. So we come to Mr. Simpson. Now, Simpson is known in 20th century writing, certainly Sitwell writes in the 1960s that Simpson was a royal jeweller at Oxford, that is during the Civil War, and subsequently at the Restoration. There's a Simpson, this is Francis Simpson, and Diana Scarisbrick mentions Simpson as a royal jeweller, as does Claude Blair in his great work on the royal jewels, the crown jewels. Simpson is a known individual. Could this be our man? So the question of having to prove that this is Francis Simpson. There's another clue in that the Goldsmiths Company records mention a Thomas Simpson, who was actually upper warden in 1633, the year he died. And Thomas Simpson had a very sort of up and down career with the Goldsmiths because he was interested in paste jewellery. But the trouble was, it was passing it off as real jewellery. And so he was thrown out of the company. But he had sold jewellery, I mean, real jewellery, to the Queen. And she petitioned the company, but she told them that he must be allowed back in. So he was allowed back in. He had some further problems because in his year as renter warden, his accounts didn't tally. And so they threw him out again. Anyway, he ended up with £5,000 left to his descendants in his will of 1633. And to his two executors, Francis and John Simpson, he left the Goldsmiths Row lease and all his goods and chattels. So Thomas Simpson was the father of the royal jeweller, Francis Simpson. I think then we have to find the proof that this man is Francis Simpson. And again, we can turn to the Goldsmiths Company records for that proof. And this is a lease to William Taylor in 1654. And this can be traced right through. So it is the relevant location for us. And the lease states the details of the property. It says that there's from the street, there's one shop and an entry, 4 cellars, whereof 2 are arched with brick, 2 yards covered with Purbeck stone, 1 parlour and 1 kitchen. That's just the ground floor. And then it goes on, of course, to the upper floors, but also all which demised premises were sometime in the holding of Francis Simpson and John Simpson, and now in the possession of the aforesaid William Taylor, lying and being in Cheap on the south side of the same street within the parish of St. Matthew, Friday Street. And if we just remind ourselves of the whereabouts of this is the property we're talking about here. And the bounds which it gives in the lease are that it abuts onto the Wheatsheaf, which was the Goldsmiths property here, down here into Friday Street, on the backs of tenements, down to the parish church, up here to the Gibbons and the Robert Cuthbert property, up here to the Wheeler property, and also the Frith. So this interior portion of the parish was taken up by that particular lease, the one that Francis Simpson had. The important point for us, I think, is that it abuts the property of the Blackmore's Head, which, as I said, was 26, 27, and 28. And so one comes to the conclusion that the jewels must have been hidden somewhere near that boundary that is between the 2 properties. And we'll come back to that. Well, if this is our proof that Francis Simpson lived next door, what sort of alibi or explanation could we give for the fact that he might well have hidden jewelry there? And I think that there are a couple of strands to this. One is that he was a royalist. He supported the crown. He'd already employed alien jewelers in the work for the Queen, and he petitioned the Queen's Council saying that in his position as a jeweler, he should be allowed to have these men working for him. Now, it was against company regulations, and indeed it became an act of parliament that alien jewelers were not to be allowed to work to London jewelers. And of the 4 men he employed, 3 were imprisoned in Guildhall, and only the 4th, who'd taken out letters of denunciation, was allowed to stay. And all those men were Dutchmen. They were members of the Dutch church. So I think this has a big impact on the cuttings of the stones, indeed, that we see in the Cheapside Hoard, that he was employing Dutch jewelers. Well, if what happened at the time after the period of the lease that we saw and the tithe assessment of 1638 was only 4 years before civil war broke out in 1642. And as you recall, Charles I tries to arrest the 5 members of Parliament, and they flee back to the City of London, and they're protected. He's not allowed to arrest them. And the court realized that the tide of rebellion has risen too high, it's become dangerous. So the court leaves London and goes ultimately to Oxford. Well, Francis Simpson, the royalist jeweler, unsurprisingly enough, goes to Oxford as well. And he is made formally royal jeweler. This is in 1642. the company receive a letter on the 27th of August, 1642, a letter from Francis Simpson requesting more information about his lease, which has by then expired, and the company have been requesting him to put forward what sum of money, i.e. fine, as was called at the time, or deposit, he wishes to pay to renew his lease. And he rather rudely says, when they ask him how long they have to wait for a reply, he says, till doomsday. And the company note, though this answer is considered scornful and affronting, he's given 20 days. Well, he's supposed to be out by Michaelmas, the 29th of September, 1642. In fact, he's still there in the October, still as a suitor for renewing his lease. And throughout the rest of 1642, there's no resolution of this, this lease which has expired, and the company wishing to maintain, know what's going to happen with the lease. All the time, of course, the events of civil war are getting worse and worse. We've had the Battle of Edge Hill, we've had the Battle of Brentford, the standoff at Turnham Green, and Simpson writes to the company saying he couldn't come to London before Lady Day next, the 25th of March. And he doesn't appear, but in the April of 1643, the company receive a letter sealed up in a paper, but the letter had neither the date nor place set down from whence it came. The bringer thereof was George Smith at Sir Maurice Abbott's house in Cornhill. It was now read, and being of a high nature, entreating the company about granting of a lease to one of the tenements in Cheap, which he usually holds without lease. It was set aside for further consideration. Well, 1643 was an unfortunate year for Francis Simpson in that the Parliament had set up a committee of sequestration, or confiscation, we would say, and they were on the lookout for estates or properties belonging to royalists who were supporting Charles I. And they were confiscating these estates and subletting them and taking the money for the parliamentary cause. And that's precisely what happened to this property here in Cheapside. It was confiscated. So Francis Simpson had no property after that date. In Oxford, things were going quite well. And in 1643, he had to take on further work because Alexander Heriot, the royal goldsmith and jeweller, had died, and Francis Simpson had to take on the work of making badges of honor, the sort of thing that you gave to ambassadors, envoys, things like that. In 1646, the Oxford Parliament surrenders, the Oxford garrison surrenders, and Francis Simpson comes back to London, where he's imprisoned and put in the Wood Street counter because he hasn't paid the sequestration fee on this property in Cheapside. And he's in prison for a number of months before his case is brought to the bar in Westminster and the case is heard. We don't hear any more about what happened until 1650, when we find that he's living in Drury Lane, and he's styled jeweller and delinquent. Delinquent is the term they used for the supporters of the crown. And during the 1650s, there's no particular information, but come the Restoration, he writes to the company requesting that he can renew his lease. and the company don't reply immediately. So Francis Simpson goes in person to the court. And the company note this, that the particulars of the proceedings are so many and large entries thereof in several books belonging to the company that they are too tedious to insert a report, that a verbal answer would suffice. They had done nothing that was wrong, and only what was good and just, and that there could be no complaint. And Mr. Simpson departed the court. Was that the end of the matter? Oh no, he then petitioned Parliament for £20,000 for the loss of jewels and taken through sequestration and plunder. There's no evidence that he ever got any of the money, but he was made royal jeweller again at the Restoration and went to live in Axe Yard in Westminster. Well, one might say that was the end of the matter, but indeed the fire of London, then in 1666, he must have thought that the jewels were gone for good. Fortunately, of course, for our, in our case, we know that was not the case. But we think it would have been at the time of the sequestration in 1643, when the bailiffs came knocking at the door, that his employees would have hurriedly hidden the jewellery. Otherwise, that would have been confiscated along with the premises, and that they were put here in the western part of his premises. We know his parlour was here, and we know that there were very substantial chimneys here because the wardens of the Goldsmiths needed to have access through this yard to check the state of the chimneys. And I think that the presence of very substantial walls would have helped the jewels to survive the fire of London, and indeed the deep basementing that happened through the 19th century. Well, you might say, why didn't he take it to Oxford? Well, he was producing bespoke diamond jewellery for the court. So the type of range of jewellery we've seen in the Cheapside Hoard wouldn't have been particularly appropriate for the court at that time, and that's why it was left behind. Well, we might just reflect on the failure of one man to renew his lease, subsequently brought great bounty to us in the early 20th century with the largest hoard of jewellery found in the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I like a good mystery, and being led through it with the detail of the evidence in front of us is truly impressive. I must say I'm entirely convinced by your argument, but I'm no specialist in this area. So if we can open the floor for questions and comments. If we take questions, comments from the room first, and then if there are any questions online, I would be.
Yeah, Nigel Israel. Are you saying that when he went to Oxford, that he left his workmen and they were still carrying on business in Cheapside?
Oh, yes, yes. I think he's every intention of coming back to Cheapside. This is why it was important for him to renew the lease, but he never clinched a deal with the company. So he was expecting to come back. I think that's quite certain.
But if he if he was intending to come back and he knew that all that stock was there, wouldn't he have been more amenable rather than telling them he wouldn't pay any money for a new lease until doomsday? Doesn't sound like a very sensible thing to do.
Well, that was before he buried it, he said. He said that. So there was a sort of running it's a commentary with the Goldsmiths Company about renewing this lease and how much work he'd done on the site, rebuilding the hall, and he was only going to offer £20 and the company wanted £300. And so there was continual negotiation. No settlement was made. And then suddenly events overtook them with the outbreak of civil war. So it seems he was too high-handed. He wanted his cake and to eat it.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. I probably my ignorance is going to show here, but who actually owns the jewelry? Who was it? The Goldsmiths Company? Was it the gentleman himself, or was it had it been commissioned by private individuals and was just being held there? It'd be interesting just to know who owned it.
Who owned the jewellery? Was it the jeweller himself? Or was it the Goldsmiths Company? Or was it?
Oh, no, it would have been the jeweller himself. These were private, individual shops. They were not. They were leased by the company. It was their freehold, but this property, the jewellery, was the jeweller himself. Yes.
Mark Hassel by name and Hassel by nature. Just to say how very much I enjoyed it, and I virtually stayed awake the whole time, which is really a huge compliment to you. I was really rather disappointed that it wasn't Hugh Middleton, because I have my flat overlooks the New River, and to hear about Hugh Middleton, and I'd love the idea if it had been him whose treasure was at Cheapside. But thank you so much for one of the best talks I've ever heard here.
Thank you very much.
Richard Ross. Do we know anything more about his family and what happened to his family? Was there a will? I mean, if there was a will, did he leave this jewel to anyone?
Oh yes. He had a brother, John, and they were both noted as royal goldsmiths. They had up to 10 children between the brother and the two brothers. We know this because the widow petitions Parliament after their death. Francis Simpson died 3 months after the fire of London and is buried in St. Margaret's, Westminster. And the widow is left chasing royal debts that hadn't been paid, and she's in extremity. I mean, this is how it's put, of course, at the time, and they have 10 children to support. It's a fairly classic case, I suppose, the Crown not paying. So yes, that certainly seems to be the case, but they're living then in Axe Yard, Westminster. They don't have a property in Cheapside anymore. There was no deal made with the company, and it's let to somebody else by that time. So I don't think that there's any later 17th century information apart from the petitions by the widow, and these are recorded in the Treasury books, actually. Yes, she keeps demanding this money, this payment.
There are no more questions, can we express our thanks again to Rosemary? It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
I give notice that the next meeting of the Society, say the 27th of April 2023, there will be a ballot using ballot boxes which opens at 4 p.m. The main meeting will start at 5 p.m. with a reception to follow. If you've not reserved your place, wish to attend or book reception tickets, please do so via the website. Meeting stands adjourned. There are some drinks.